Okay, then I'll start with cladding. We first looked at the two guidance questions. The first one was, how do climate changes and weather extremes, such as changes in temperature and groundwater levels, affect different building materials, and we added structures, and what strategies help to protect the stock effectively. First, we define major risks, such as heavy rain, storms, prolonged weather conditions, such as rain, or, for example, droughts, periods of intense heat, and the falling water levels. Of course, this results in problems for monuments and for the cladding. For example, when the groundwater level drops, then the subsoil dries out, which on the one hand leads to the subsidence and cracks, and on the other hand, in the case of pile foundations, for example, can cause them to rot. During hot spells, we have summer overheating, which then of course requires a certain amount of heat protection, and with long-lasting weather conditions such as rain, the masonry, which is the outer protective layer of a building with the plaster on top of it, is naturally penetrated, and of course there's also a longer vegetation period for growths such as moss and similar plants. A big point is of course also heavy rain, which is then associated with strong rain, which is of course a very big challenge for the facades, and also we can talk about storms, which can of course be accompanied by heavy rain and the like. Also, wind can have effects on the roof coverings, and for example also the covering of roofs as a result. And in the second part we talked about strategies and adaptation measures, and Killian is going to present that now. We also stumbled on this term, and at some point we talked about both topics. I also want to talk about all measures here at the conference, and from my point of view it was a good hint that we first had to define the visiting methods and analyzing methods, and the approach for adaptations. So what questions do we want to ask ourselves about the buildings, and so what do we have to deal with at all? And there is the desire on the one hand, of course, to do there's of course the desire on one hand to do a renovation, and we have the concept as, for example, when we work on roofs, whether one identifies storms is more of a risk. Chairs, for example, are designed historically of course the chairs are designed differently, and so we worry about that type of things. And on the other hand, there is just some they're just dimensioned differently. Oh, can you still hear me? Test 1 2. So there are structures that have smaller dimensions, and then we can statically reinforce such a roof truss. Then we went over different categories of measures on the building envelope, on the cladding. So the question of what to do with the facade, if you have cracks, if you have moisture penetration, making windows, strengthening windows under certain circumstances, but also issues of structural moisture protection. So we asked ourselves the question, for example, in the selections of materials, in the case, for example, when we have heavy rainfall or under long-lasting rain, facades can become damp, and the question is whether you always have to work with lime plaster and traditional materials, Or, for example, you can use other materials in such cases, such as water repellent plasters or other painting systems. This, however, of course, with necessary caution when introducing different measures. Yes, and ultimately we came out with the question, is it at all a problem with the adaptation of buildings? Some said that it is not a problem at all because the solutions have been well known for a long time. I wouldn't agree with that 100%, but I do think that it's really about defining an approach. So what do we have to deal with, and what do we have to pay particular attention to, and what can be done preventively and reactively. And then last but not least, we talked about standards, some of which need to be questions, maybe adapted to. The calculation methods and structural engineering were also mentioned here, and ultimately the topic of raising awareness and as a central criterion for maintaining a building, as of course the people who take care of it and look after it. And then the question is, how can we reach them and involve them and address them? Yeah, as a last resort we mentioned here, maybe we have to give up certain monuments or accompany them in their decay and simply accept that. That's also maybe a possibility, maybe an approach, but as I say, that's a last resort. Have I forgotten something? So that's our summary, and the whole thing is still a bit more comprehensive, and it is also written down, and you can come and read it here. Thank you very much. Yeah, I've also thought about this point to rethink methods of investigation, so it's also maybe not brought up, hasn't been brought up so far. Also fundamentally question the methodologies that we use to approach these problems. It's also very systematically structured with the various underlines. Perhaps this will help us rethink how we approach certain things from the very beginning. And then with the example that you said with lime plaster, maybe it is also conceivable that we should rethink the concepts of restoration. Maybe we could also go in the direction of the idea of repairing. Maybe I'm misunderstanding it now, but maybe it is necessary to replace certain materials when they become overused, when elements are replaced anyways, so that perhaps one type of wood is replaced by another completely different material because the original type of wood doesn't even grow anymore, and if that's not suitable for the future. Maybe also think more about whether we still need to open ourselves up a bit in the area of restoration and measures for buildings, and perhaps also think about materials and solutions that maybe are not fully historically accurate, but are materials and solutions that will still be durable in 100 years, and that will help the monuments over the next decades. Are there any other questions about the cladding or any comments, please? Yeah, I would like to know whether you also, in your group, you also talked about more modern buildings, because it sounded to me a little bit as if you only talked about traditional building methods and materials, that they were especially the main focus. But we're now only dealing with the large part of the stock that we have to deal with are more modern materials, with newer construction methods, with composite materials, where other questions arise, and I think that's important to discuss here. That's a good topic that we didn't really talk about, but what I didn't mention earlier is perhaps that we talked about thank you. This is a really interesting point. We didn't really talk about it, but what I did mention before, and I can add right now, is that we talked about cladding. So the issue of energy retrofitting as a contribution, about protection, which of course has its consequences. So on the one hand, the question of irreversibility